Thank you, Rachel. Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to share an introductory slide. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that. Welcome to our first plenary session. My name is Hannah Lambie-Mumford, as Rachel just said. I'm from the University of Sheffield, and I'll be chairing this first session today, which will take the form of a panel discussion, where we're going to hear third sector perspectives on evidence-informed action to address household food insecurity in the UK. So firstly, I would like to welcome and introduce our panellists, who are all at the forefront of work and analysis on food security issues in the UK. So first of all, we have Anna Taylor, who is the Executive Director of the Food Foundation, and among her many advisory roles is also currently working as Chief and Independent Advisor to Henry Dimbleby for the development of the National Food Strategy. We also have Emma Revie, who is the Chief Executive of the Trussell Trust, which supports over 1,200 food bank centres to provide emergency food to people in crisis. We have Kartik, who is the Western European researcher at Human Rights Watch, and last year wrote the report, which I'm sure many of you have read, on the UK, Nothing Left in the Cupboards, Austerity, Welfare Cuts and the Right to Food. And we also have Dan Crossley, who is the Executive Director of the Food Ethics Council, an independent think tank whose mission is to accelerate the shift towards fair food systems that respect people, animals and the planet. So welcome to all of the panellists, and thank you very much for joining us and participating in this panel. The format of the session then will be, we'll first of all hear reflections from each of the panellists on how household food insecurity can be reduced in the UK, the progress that has been made towards this so far and the challenges that we still face. These reflections will sort of look back on the progress made before COVID-19 and where we'd got to, as well as some of the new issues and progress since the pandemic. After these reflections, we will have a couple of questions and then an open Q&A, which will be done with the hand raise function, as Rachel and Katie outlined earlier. And then when invited to ask a question, you will be able to turn on your microphone and camera, as it would be great for the speakers to be able to sort of see and hear your questions. As Rachel just said, the chat function will be enabled after the speakers have all offered their initial reflections, and a reminder again that this session is being recorded. Okay, so to begin with, I would like to invite Anna, please, to offer your initial reflections. I'm going to take this slide down, and then, hi Anna, thank you, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and good morning, everybody. It would be lovely to see you, but I can't see you. But it's really great to have a chance to interact with you anyway through this session, and very much also looking forward to hearing what my fellow panelists, their reflections, because I think this is an interesting way to start the day in terms of thinking about, you know, where we'd got to pre-COVID, which is what I'm going to start with. How I think the COVID crisis has sort of changed the narrative around food insecurity, and then talk briefly about where I think the greatest opportunities are for change now. And obviously I'm coming at this sort of from a Food Foundation perspective, and I think others on the panel will bring other angles on this. So I'm really hoping that through the conversation that we have together, we can shape that narrative and reach a common perspective on it. So a few reflections pre-COVID. So I think there were a couple of very important moments that sort of happened, I think, between, I guess, the last ENUF Conference and the beginning of the COVID crisis. So one was the Environmental Audit Committee, one of the parliamentary select committees, who was looking into the Sustainable Development Goals, took a deep dive really into looking at the goal to end hunger that's captured within the Sustainable Development Goals. And I was fortunate enough to be giving evidence to that committee alongside Kath Dalmeny from Sustain. And that conversation with the committee, I think, led to a quizzing of 3 government ministers at the time about who was really responsible for tackling food insecurity in the in government. And it was very clear when that question was posed to these 3 ministers from 3 different departments that there was no real leadership on the issue, and certainly no single department or minister that felt that it was within their brief to try and grab this problem and solve it. Like, that was an important moment in my view. I think, as Rachel mentioned, quite soon afterwards, in February 2019, DWP committed to start measuring food insecurity, which was another really significant moment. Many of us had been campaigning for. Rachel Louvstra played a really critical role in that commitment, and that was an important sort of step, probably perhaps also triggered by the Environmental Audits Committee investigation. Later on in 2019, the Food Foundation was involved with a whole group of other charities and organisations in supporting a cross-party parliamentary group looking into children's food insecurity, which led to the publication of the Children's Future Food Inquiry. It was a year-long piece of research and also engagement with children and young people to hear about their experiences around food and to really understand the data and their lived experiences alongside one another. And we felt at the time, that was in April last year, that we were really being listened to in terms of the calls which the children made in their Children's Right to Food Charter, and the Department for Education ministers in particular were very engaged in discussing how we could make the charter recommendations a reality. But I think, though it seems like a long time ago now, that last 12 months has also been, we've seen politically, of course, a number of reshuffles. We've seen the Brexit no deal concern sort of heighten in the run-up in the autumn, and then we've had an election. And so politically, the situation it's been a very difficult context in which to progress policy conversations. So I say that's a sort of a little bit of a backdrop. And I think now we're in the COVID crisis, I think the situation, I would say, has changed really quite significantly. And some of that is positive. I think if we're to reflect now, the number of people engaged and concerned around food insecurity has significantly shifted, I would argue. I think we now have a cross-government ministerial committee that's focused on food vulnerability. That, you know, seemed like that was a very long way off 6 months ago. We have all the charitable sector getting together under the Voluntary and Community Sector Emergency Platform to coordinate action on food insecurity and to really look at where food insecurity, how the pattern of it experienced across the country, and being a very data-driven approach to the response. We've had a number of government commitments. The welfare crisis grants were particularly important, and of course the Marcus Rashford letter, which overturned the decision on school holiday provision last week, yeah. And then when we look at local authorities and businesses, many local authorities have dramatically scaled up their efforts to understand vulnerability to food insecurity and put in place different food provisioning packages. And many businesses are talking about vulnerable groups in a way that they have never done before, particularly some of the major supermarket retailers. So some of these things are perhaps signals of a sea change, but certainly signals of something being quite different to how it was before. I mean, I would argue that much of the response has been quite piecemeal. It's not been proportionate to need in any way. And I think we've got in a big muddle between where in-kind food provision and where financial assistance versus in-kind food provision needs to be separated, and we need to use the right instrument for the right problem. And we've over-relied, I would say, on in-kind food assistance, with a number of risks that go attached to that into the future. However, I think we are still in a place where food insecurity has a prominence, which allows us to really try and think clearly now about the right policies going forward, because of course when you look at any number of scenarios as to what's going to happen over the next 12 months, I can't see one that is actually going to be a situation where food insecurity is going to improve. Two other important contextual points, I think. One is around inequalities more generally and the virus itself, and the extent to which that has exposed both in terms of the mortality and morbidity associated with the disease, expose those inequalities, whether it's when looking at it obviously very starkly through the AME communities, but also more generally in terms of areas of deprivation across the country. And then the second thing I think that the virus has done is highlighted how important our diets are. It's exposed that if you've got that people who experience obesity are at greater risk of getting sick and also of dying of the disease. BMI is closely linked to those outcomes, and I think it shone a light on the importance of our diet and getting that right. And obviously food insecurity and its contribution to dietary outcomes is an important part of that. We're tracking quite a lot of these different elements on our COVID food tracker on our website, just to mention that in case people want to delve into some of those issues in more detail. So then finally, in terms of what we should be thinking about now and where there might be opportunities for change. Many of you may have been following the House of Lords Select Committee inquiry into, it's got a very long title, I'm not going to get it exactly right, food, poverty, the environment and health, I think. It's being chaired by Lord Krebs. And there's been an interesting set of evidence sessions, particularly looking into the extent to which social security levels capture the cost of healthy diet and other aspects of protecting, health and well-being, kind of minimum levels of expenditure needed to protect that health and well-being. And I think 2 evidence sessions now with DWP, most recently with Minister Will Quince, have shown that is not how benefit levels are calculated. And I think we're going into a situation now where, first of all, we have 3 million more people who've applied for universal credit, but also a situation coming up where the demand on universal credit is likely to grow exponentially in the context of the furlough scheme stopping. And I think we're going to be very quickly asking whether or not these systems are fit for purpose. Are they fit for a future where we actually need to be helping people to live healthy lives, even if they are not employed or don't have sufficient income coming through employment? So I would argue there that we can quite quickly build a narrative around some the core minimums. I mean, a lot of work has been done by academics in this area around what are those minimum levels which should be factored into policy instruments, whether it's wage levels or social security levels. And then secondly, I think the Marcus Rashford intervention has opened up a significant space around children's food in particular, and highlighted the critical which some of these food safety nets, which are funded by the government, play, whether it's free school meals or Healthy Start or some of the other instruments which are in place. And let's not forget, we're going to have much larger numbers of children eligible for these schemes. They're going to play an even more important role in children's diets into the future as more children become. We know that the children who are on those schemes already depend heavily on them for good food, and many more will do so. So we have to make sure that those schemes do their job properly, that they reach all the people that need, the children that need them, that they're delivered in a high quality way, and that we think about those schemes in terms of the whole year and not just the term time. Sorry, I'm over time. So I think that's an area that we'll be particularly pushing on in July. We'll be doing a 1-year-on progress report, and very much hope that you'll be able to support our call for a Children's Right to Food Commission to really tackle some of those policy challenges. Thanks. Sorry, Hannah. I didn't see a reminder at 5 minutes, sorry.
Thanks so much. Thanks for that, Anna. Okay, Emma, we'd love to hear from you now, please. If you could put your camera back on and your microphone, that would be super. Thank you.
Hi there. Hannah, can I just check my camera has been on throughout? Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you now, yeah.
Oh, great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Hi everyone, and thanks very much for having me here today to be part of this incredibly important and timely conversation. For those of you who don't know much about the Trussell Trust, we're an anti-poverty charity that, as Hannah said, supports a network of 1,250 food bank centres across the UK to provide emergency food, ongoing support to help people who are locked into poverty, but also to campaign to change the need for food banks. And together in Trussell Trust and across our food bank network, we are deeply committed to ending the need for food banks. And critical to that is the research and evidence that we gather from the front lines, but also being part of a collaboration of organisations, many of whom will be here today to fight for that, and the fact that there should never be the need for food banks. Today, in terms of answering the question around how household food insecurity can be reduced in the UK, I'm going to be drawing a lot on our State of Hunger research that was carried out by Heriot-Watt University last year and is ongoing over the next 2 years as well. And I think the important thing to say before we look at the impact of COVID is that we were already in a crisis situation pre-COVID. We have seen over the last 5 years a 73% increase in the number of people having to come to food banks for emergency food. And the reason they're coming to food banks for emergency food is because they have been assessed as not having enough money to be able to buy food. And so the crisis there is not around lack of access to food, but about lack of the financial security to be able to buy food, and therefore the lack of financial security to be able to buy other essentials that are important. So I think that was my first reflection as I was preparing for this session, is that there was a crisis before COVID, and COVID has exacerbated and amplified that crisis. But we know a lot from the research we've done historically as to what the reasons are for that, and also about the potential solutions that would help us to ensure that there was the appropriate safety net in place to catch people before they have to come to a food bank. In the previous year, we saw a 19% increase. So pre-COVID, we saw a 19% increase in food bank use from 17-18 to 18-19. And I think that's a helpful statistic to hold on to as I share with you some information around the increase we've seen through COVID. According to our State of Hunger report, 94% of people coming to food banks are experiencing destitution. And by that I mean unable to access essentials such as food, but also experiencing insecure housing, issues around accessing hygiene items, and the whole range of essentials. And the average household income for a family at food banks pre-COVID was £50 a week after rent, so significantly lower income than Social Metrics Commission poverty line, so about 5 times lower than that, £50 a week. And the key drivers that State of Hunger identified that were bringing people to food banks were an inadequate social security system, adverse life events, and a lack of informal support. And just to run through that in a little bit more detail, we know that 86% of people who are coming to food banks, their main source of income is benefits. And over 2/3 of them had experienced issues around accessing their benefits. And some of that is about built-in issues around the 5 weeks wait for your first payment on universal credit, but other issues around sanctions, about reclaiming debt repayments from universal credit payments. We know that 40% of people referred to food banks were having money taken off their benefits to repay debts, and the vast majority of these were to the DWP. So there's inherent issues around the adequacy and sufficiency of benefits as a source of income and preventing people coming to food banks. But the State of Hunger also identified that the majority of people that were coming to food banks had also experienced an adverse life event in the last 12 months. That could be something around eviction or around divorce, ill health, or losing your job. So a significant income shock had taken place that had also forced somebody to have to come to a food bank. And finally, the vast majority of people who are coming to food banks had either exhausted support from family or friends, or were resource poor in terms of those social networks, social support networks. And the research found that even with issues with the benefit system, and even having endured an adverse life event, if there was a sufficiency of family support and informal support around people, that could hold people through so as they didn't have to come to a food bank. But the compound effect of all three of these issues leads people to have to come to a food bank. So what's happened during COVID? Well, we've seen extraordinary increases, and those increases were instantaneous. So in the last 2 weeks of March, we saw an 81% increase in food bank use. In the first compared to the same time last year. In the first 2 weeks of March, we'd seen a 12% increase. on the previous year. So as the crisis kicked in, immediately people were falling right the way through the safety net and finding themselves dependent on a food bank. And that continued into April, where we've seen an 89% increase in food bank use, and very horrifyingly, 107% increase in the number of children receiving parcels from food banks. These are obviously significantly higher than the normal increases we would see. So our food banks have really been shaken to their core in terms of responding to that level of demand, but they've done an extraordinary job in being there for people in their communities at this time of crisis. But these are unprecedented levels of increase at the same time as government have put in unprecedented levels of support through the job retention scheme and income support scheme. Even with those interventions, we are seeing these unprecedented, almost doubling in the numbers of people coming to food banks. And the reasons are the same as they were before. So low income being the issue, the insufficiency of benefits people are receiving to cover the cost of essential are a key driver. And we know that it's about people not having enough money, because our referral process has remained the same. So people are being referred to food banks when they don't have enough money to be able to afford food. And so that brings into stark relief the need to urgently address the insufficiencies in our social security system to ensure that nobody is having to come to a food bank. Obviously, there's been an increase in adverse life events as many more people have faced losing their jobs. And at the same time, people have not been able to access their informal support networks as easily due to lockdown. So all of these things compound to drive this increase into food banks. But we were clear pre-COVID on where the solutions lay to this, and the solutions are around ensuring people have sufficient income to be able to buy food, but also to be able to access other essentials. And that is around increasing the rates of working age benefits, removing punitive factors like a 5-week wait for that initial payment, which universally across the third sector is accepted as being a real problem that immediately drives people into debt and into crisis and directly into food banks. A reduction in the number of reductions that are taken off of benefits. So at the moment, repaying for advanced loans is still being deducted from people during COVID. So we need to just ensure that the benefit system is not being, the deductions that are being made from benefits are not such that it's leaving people with insufficient funding. So together with organisations, other charities, and I'm conscious I'll be about to run out of time, other organisations across the third sector, we've come together and asked the government to put in place a temporary coronavirus income support scheme that tackles some of these underlying issues. The job retention scheme has been fantastic, and I think if I was to say one thing to watch looking forward, the thing that is keeping me up at night at the moment is, as the job retention scheme ends, what will that do to the number of people who find themselves experiencing destitution? Resolution Foundation report recently identified that on average people saw a loss of income of about 9% whilst moving on to the job retention scheme. But the same people in the same circumstances moving on to universal credit rather than the job retention scheme saw a 47% reduction on average in their income. So as many people potentially move off of the job retention scheme and into unemployment, that is deeply concerning in terms of how that will drive food bank numbers and people experiencing hardship. In terms, just briefly to end, in terms of the things that our coronavirus income support scheme are focused on, is increasing the level of benefits, reducing the costs that people are paying, so reducing deductions from benefits, making sure that anyone who needs financial support, particularly those with no recourse to public funds, are able to access it and nobody is excluded from being able to access it. But also particular attention to families with children and children. So the reduction, the removal of the 2-child limit, the removal of the cap on benefits, which is preventing families with children being able to get their full entitlement that they need, particularly during this time, and a particular focus on an increase to the child element of universal credit or child tax credits. I think I'll stop there. That gives you an idea of what our research has shown us today and the things we think we need to focus on going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. That was super. Thanks ever so much. Can I invite Kartik, please, to share your reflections? Thank you. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having me. I I've had to rethink my presentation a little bit in light of what Anna and Emma have said, partly to avoid repetition as well, because I think there's only so many times you can smack people over the head with the same data, especially when many of them are already sympathetic to what we're trying to say, and it's only what 10:15 in the morning on the first day of this conference. Look, I begin first by saying it's an immense privilege to speak to this group. I tried doing a quick list of the participants, scanning the list of participants to see the people whose work I'd referred to or read in the process of doing Human Rights Watch's research, the organizations that third sector people from the third sector represent, and the extent to which we relied in our work on not just the data and evidence, but also the connections in the front line that many of your organizations helped provide in the doing of our research and continue to do so. I mean, it was only 4 weeks ago that I was last doing field interviews over my computer screen. So thank you for that. My plan was to do a quick tally, but looking at the list of participants, that's pretty much impossible given there's so many of you. And the second thing is perhaps maybe while speaking here to just take a step back to the detail of what's going on in the UK to sort of a more global perspective. So Human Rights Watch is an international human rights organization, and the way we work, there's 400 of us dotted around the world, 3 of whom focus on Western Europe, of which I am one. And we look at the application of human rights law in various countries around the world, the wide variety of human rights law. And our method is to investigate where we believe human rights violations or abuses are taking place, to expose those through our standard research methods, communicating to wider public, through the press, to parliamentarians, and then to push for change. And in this context, we got involved in the issue of food insecurity in the UK and food poverty in the UK, and I suppose poverty more generally and inequality. And the questions you asked were, how do we reduce food insecurity, and then what are the challenges we see? And for me, how we reduce food insecurity is there's 3 sort of steps without getting into the details of the data. First is you have to take stock of the levels. And there's such a wide wealth of data in the UK, from whether it's going from individual independent food bank level or individual Trussell Trust food bank distribution statistics to Joseph Rowntree Foundation studies of destitution and Office of National Statistics indices of deprivation. I mean, the availability of data is very wide, and so the exposition of that is the second step, is laying it out clearly and systematically, so no one piece is dismissed as being anecdotal or that the Mandy Rice Davis argument would apply. Of course, Emma Revie from the Trussell Trust would say more people are going to food banks because she represents the Trussell Trust, right? And so these sorts of arguments are very tiring, and I think it's important to put the different pieces of data together and the evidence together in order that you can dispel those things, while at the same time in that exposition making sure that you're not too I don't know what the word is, but my research supervisor often accuses me of this. He says I'm too wonky. So try to communicate in a way that doesn't come across as just sort of wonkish levels of detail. And the final thing is to address causes and solutions, which is what I think pieces of research like the State of Hunger research, like the joint work that's being done around the COVID fund are doing, which is to say, look, here's a problem, these are driving causes, and these are potential solutions that we can have. And so in that context, Human Rights Watch has undertaken a set of research. You referred very kindly to the detailed report we published in May 2019, just over a year ago now, looking at changes to the social security system in England. It was called the UK for an international audience, but the analysis was really focused on England in that report. And looked specifically at cuts to family and child-related benefits in particular as driving factors for people needing emergency food aid support. And we released that in the same week that Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, released his final findings on the UK. And we worked quite closely with their team in sort of making sure our findings and theirs dovetailed, and that we were talking about food insecurity and poverty in the context of a wider set of why poverty was being exacerbated in the UK, in the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, and why that was such a disgrace. But that wasn't where our research ended. So in October 2019, we published a piece of research on the very real risks posed by a hard Brexit on food supply and emergency food aid providers. And then in May 2020, in light of the latest crisis, the COVID pandemic, we did a piece of research and published that specifically focused on the impact of school closures on children's right to food. Now, if you were to ask me what we could do with all this research, I'm not going to get into the details of what we found. I mean, my guess is over the course of the next 2 days, people who know the detail of that better than I do will spell it all out for us over and over and over again, right? But I think what we can do at a much larger level as a human rights organization is, and would benefit from support from an academic audience such as this in doing, is first to ensure that the right to food finds its way into domestic law in the UK. And this this is a real long-term goal. But I think that a moment like this, when the precariousness, the closeness to the edge of not having enough food is as exposed as it is a moment to strike on that. And it will help answer, putting that right and a responsibility into law will help answer the question that Anna raised earlier in her talk about who is responsible, right? It's no longer sufficient for government departments to say, well, it ain't my job, I'm in DEFRA, this is DWP, DW says, hey, this ain't my job, this is actually a health issue. This ain't my job, this is education because it's about school food. Like, that has to end. And putting the right to food in domestic law is one very powerful way to do that. And it's not unprecedented. Other countries have done it with mixed success, but without doing it, you're not going to be able to tell what success you're going to have. A second is to increase the level of attention to socioeconomic inequality and social and economic rights more generally in domestic law. And we're seeing, as the previous speakers have said, a shift in local authority thinking, a shift even in supermarkets about realizing that social economic rights and the ability to have ability to have spending money and disposable income is so important as people reach or near a point of crisis where maybe 6 months ago they never thought they would be one paycheck away from unemployment and a breadline, right? So I think that's really important. And I think the third thing that's really important as well at the present moment is to push hard for the food insecurity measurement data to not just be a one-off exercise or an exercise repeated over in 2 cycles, but to become something that is protected by law, rather than being a discretionary act of government that publishes for a set period of time until the government of the future or the same government of the present in the future changes its mind about the utility or the expense of the gathering of that data and just decides to do away with it. And I think protecting it as a matter of law will make a huge difference. There are a couple of things that I wanted to say at the end about challenges, and I'll just sort of telegraph these very quickly because of the time. Is I think for somebody who works in human rights law, I think there are 3 things that we struggle with in terms of how we do this work. The first is striking a balance between the purity of the advocacy call, and the purity of the vision, and the purity of our aim, and the need for compromise around what is possible in a given political moment. And I imagine some of the questions will come back to this. The second is around thinking in terms of incremental wins and incremental advocacy asks as opposed to long-term goals. So the question is, do we want food insecurity measurement now as a discretionary policy as opposed to the right to food in human rights law? Do we want vouchers in one country, the United Kingdom, extended over one summer as a result of one footballer's involvement in an already existing and extremely vital campaign led by youth activists. Let's not forget that. Do we want just that, or do we want to push for much broader, like, sea change on how food and play and children's rights are seen in terms of the state's responsibility to its citizens and residents, right? These deep questions are ones we're not going to resolve in a 2-day conference, but these are the ones we should be coming back to. The last one, the last challenge for me as a human rights researcher is, how do we balance between the exposition of data and real lives? Because, you know, we're always fighting against two sets of readers, types of readers. One who say, what you show me is anecdotal, and it's just you're not showing me the data, you're not showing me systemic patterns. And the other set who say, well, stop telling me about the numbers of the thousands of people queuing up for food banks, and start telling me about the real impact of their lives, in order that I can convince my parliamentary constituents that this matters, in order that I can convince a government minister that these are real lives. And I think those are the sorts of balances that we all, constantly strike, regularly get wrong, and have to refine. I'm done. I've hit 10 minutes, which is longer than 8.
Thank you, Kartik, for those really interesting reflections. Dan, can I invite you for yours now, please?
Thank you, Hannah. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Brilliant. So fantastic to join you. Like Kartik, just to say, first of all, thank you for the invitation. Humbled genuinely to be part of this amazing virtual audience. A shame we can't see you all, but fantastic, first of all, that ENUF, as a community of NGOs, academics and others interested in this space, that you are coming together. I guess I would start saying an obvious point: we're not doing enough. The collective we, NGO sector, those on the front line, we're not a frontline NGO. We're more of a think tank. We're not doing enough. Academics aren't doing enough. That's a depressing note on which to start. I'm not saying we should all ramp up necessarily, just do lots more research for the sake of it. We need to be much more coherent, more joined up. We tell government off for not being joined up enough, but we need to be more coherent and joined up, which is why it's fantastic that ENUF exists in order to be able to try to bring some of that together. I'm going to say 2 or 3 things. Firstly, I want to talk about Domino's, not Domino's Pizza Company. I want to talk about an experiment that my 9-year-old son was asked to do by school. I'm sure lots of you juggling homeschooling at the moment, was doing a couple of weeks ago a challenge set by his year 4, which is all about chain reaction. They were asked to do a chain reaction experiment. So we had this vision. My 9-year-old said, right, we'll get a book on a slope, we'll have a marble that goes down the book, knocks into a toy car, pushes it forward, knocks some Lego over, and then that knocks this big, long snake of dominoes all the way over, a chain reaction. I said, brilliant, let's do it. So we built it. We got halfway through, dominoes slipped, and all the dominoes got knocked over before we could finish it. We tried again, same thing happened. Tried again, got a bit further. Before we got to the end, my unsteady hand knocked the domino over. We kept trying probably 14, 15 times. What's the point? Why on earth am I talking about dominoes to an audience of informed, empowered? It's a good question. I asked myself the same question this morning. And without stretching the metaphor too much, I guess the point is that in the end we got there. We changed the surface on which we were setting this up. It was a bit of a bumpy table. We moved it onto a flatter surface. We left some gaps when we were setting it up, so that if some fell over, only a few would fall over, and we could just fill in the gaps right at the end. The point is, things can fall down very quickly. We've seen during COVID-19, household food insecurity was a huge issue in the UK before COVID-19, and we now know, we're all vulnerable, and some are more vulnerable than others, we know that, but things can fall. The situation is very fragile. But on a more positive note, it's helpful to think, stop and pause and say, what's causing the problem? Again, I'm not saying we should stop and pontificate and not act, but I think it's helpful just to put a minute and say, what is really, really causing this problem? Why are all these things falling down before we have a chance to rebuild properly? And how can we plan better? How can we make changes? How can we rebuild you know, how can we persevere and make sure we get to the end? As I say, I don't want to stretch that metaphor too far. I don't think it's the right analogy for some of what we're talking about, but it just struck me a couple of weeks ago that everything is very fragile, but crucially, if we stop and think what's causing the problem and get on and rebuild in a different way, we can make real progress. I would say, in terms of how to reduce household food insecurity, a lot's been said already. I won't repeat all that. We at Food Ethics Council don't have all the answers. I say we're not a frontline organisation. Are interested in a fair food system in the round. But one of the key things we're doing, we've started some work in Sheffield recently, and what we're interested in is a question: how do we build community resilience? So how do we build community food resilience? For us, that feels like a really, really important question, and we'd love to get you to input on that. So what are the key ingredients we need, and how are these nurtured? How can we nurture those? What can we learn from some of the more resilient communities during COVID-19, and how can we help? How can they help build the case for investing in some of the socioeconomic structures that we need? So rather than starting with food per se and giving food away to people, which we recognise the challenges there. How do we build community resilience? For us, feels a really important place to start. We're not pretending we're the first people to think about community resilience. We're clearly not, but we're working with some food aid providers and community organisations in Sheffield to, with them, try and work out how we can, the shorthand, develop exit strategies for food aid provision that we've seen in the past. So that's something we're working on. How do we build community resilience? We also recognise that the government is not doing enough. Consecutive governments are not doing enough. As I said, we do need to very strongly echo Kartik's point about the pushing for sea change, right to food, that longer term perspective rather than some of the piecemeal solutions. We held a food policy on trial event last week, a week before, where we explore policy ideas. In this case, we looked at universal basic income, which isn't a food policy, you might say, which is very true. It's a social policy, but we think that drawing the links between UBI and basic income and food insecurity are really important. The jury found that felt it was the single most powerful tool to eliminate household food insecurity. Not the answer on its own, crucially, definitely not the answer on its own. But we think that making sure that money on its own is not enough, but giving people cash and having that platform, empowering people, everyone, that dignity and the universality that UBI brings, to enable them to participate more fully in society and in our food systems is really powerful. So you can go back, listen to that, make your own mind up on that, if of interest. We do need to learn from other countries. We heard from Val Tarasuk in that trial. We need to draw in research from other countries much more than we have in the past. And my final point on this is coming back to the work that we're starting to do, which is all around how do we reframe poverty using what we call food citizenship. So under a consumer mindset that we've been in for the last arguably 30 years or more, the answer seems to be to throw free food at the problem, and often culturally inappropriate, often unhealthy food. And again, we recognise that the short-term emergency need people have. We're not denying that. But under a food citizenship lens, we're thinking, how can we treat each other as food citizens and empower people to participate in society? So we don't have all the answers on that. We're just kickstarting this project in that space now. We'd love to tap into the expertise, share and learn from others who are doing pioneering work across the UK. And research is a critical part of that. So thank you, everyone that is taking part in this. Let's be more coherent, let's be more ambitious, and enough is enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks to you all. Okay, while everyone in the audience has a little think and formulates their questions, since we set out on the conference and invited you of these initial reflections, we're also conscious of two key themes that the conference is addressing. One is the use of evidence in policy and practice, and the other is obviously the situation with the COVID-19 outbreak. So while everyone takes a moment to think of their questions before they get ready to put their hands up, if I could just really quickly ask the panel to highlight any key initial thoughts they might have around the use of evidence that they haven't already mentioned, or anything that you really think we just need to spend a moment reflecting on in relation to COVID-19, what you think might be going well or particularly is a worry at this moment. Just a couple of seconds while I get my head around the hands up, please. Dan, do you want to go first? We'll go back round the list if that's okay. Just a couple of seconds, that would be super.
Yeah,
thank you.
So research, I'd say some research into some of the structural causes, issues behind inequality, I think are really important. Something around I think there's still a big gap about intersectionality. So food insecurity affects people differently depending on their gender, race, religion, age, disability. I think we need to do much more in that space. I think Hannah's book, Hannah will tell me off for saying this, but Hannah's book is extremely helpful as a way of capturing kind of where things are at, and the evidence from organisations like Food Foundation and work with Rachel Loopster, etc., really powerful. Very briefly on the second question, I think there is momentum, very much echo what Anna said earlier. There's momentum about the visibility of the issue, I think, that we need to use and build on. And it sounds not exploit, that sounds it's not the right phrase, but we need to recognise that, and now is a time when we can do something. The one risk just to watch out for is during COVID, we've seen big business come together with government much more closely. I'm not anti-business, but I think there is a risk that some of those major food businesses and government have got very cosy, and we need to make sure that doesn't sort of get too cosy. Essentially, I'll stop there.
Lovely. Kartik, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, on evidence, I mean, I think it's really worth saying that in the last 2 months, the sorts of evidence that have been brought together have been really kind of striking. Food Foundation surveys that Rachel has worked with have been remarkable. The Trussell Trust and IFAN's shared research, child poverty action groups findings. It's just it really is a question of how we collectively bring that stuff together. And I wonder if this is a moment in which some of us from organizations that generate some of the data ought to be a bit more brave about radical transparency of the data that we have, and to say that here are the findings as we present them in our brochure and our slides, but here are all the data from our survey, from our interviews, anonymized, obviously, protecting the integrity of those participants, because we know that on this call are somewhere between 90 and 120 people working in universities who may be able to take from that data or pull together a piece of data, things that we couldn't do ourselves. And it will also, I think, I mean, it's not without risk, right? Publishing the whole survey results also opens you up to criticism. Like a clever opponent will poke all the holes in precisely every argument you've made. But I think this may be a moment to start thinking about some of that. One piece of data that for me would be really useful to have is, or encourage to try and work out how to get more of this, is data from individual advice centers and citizens advice, what used to be called bureau. So independent ones, as well as ones affiliated with the citizens advice system, in terms of referrals, in terms of what people are, what advisors are seeing at the front line. So those are some thoughts, and maybe this is an affliction that happens to men who are fathers of small children, but I will repeat what Dan said and just say I think this might be enough is enough for me to go on.
Thank you. Emma, did you have any thoughts? Emma, you're muted, sorry. Emma, you're muted, sorry.
I'm on it. Done. Sorry. I said quite a lot about our data in my bit at the beginning, just to say that here at Watt University are also doing a rapid response analysis for us during COVID and helping us to kind of forecast forward what we might see in terms of food bank use throughout the rest of this year and going into next year, which is incredibly helpful and will be very insightful to understanding those drivers and what we're up against. But in terms of kind of building momentum, I think the collaboration across the anti-poverty sector has been extraordinary during this time. There's nothing that we've said as presenters here that is different from one another. We all identify what the kind of systemic issues are that are driving people to experience food insecurity, and we have fairly consistent views as to how those should be tackled. And so I think the collaboration thus far has been amazing, and that's what we need going forward to really ensure change. So I'm encouraged, but also committed to enough is enough, and how do we achieve that together?
Thanks, Emma. And Anna, and then we've got some questions coming through. So thank you, Anna.
Yeah, I mean, we've been gathering a lot of data, as you all know, and certainly I share Kartik's aspiration on transparency. We've been giving our data to lots of different people who've been wanting to do further analysis of it and tried to be as transparent as possible. We could put it all on the website, you're right, that's a good suggestion. But I think it's a really good point and an important point, and we've been trying to really get it out there as much as possible so that other people can bring insights from it that we might not have spotted. And Rachel has been really amazing in doing secondary analysis of a lot of the data. For me, and I think the other thing, I think the IFAN data, the Trussell Trust data and our data, and many other people's, I guess these three particularly on the food insecurity stuff, has been really important in shaping the media narrative, I think. And I think we have a much more constructive media narrative at the moment than we've had for a while. And you see it across all the newspapers, really quite in-depth reporting on this issue, and so I think we're in a good. That's something good to build on. An area where I think I feel certainly a frustrating sort of lack of data is really understanding what the full picture of local authority response has been and demand of local authority. And by local authority, I actually also mean local authorities in collaboration with the voluntary and community sector. It feels to me like we all know of a number of great examples. We probably all know a few bad examples, but what that adds up to is a picture. We have no, I don't think, a collective sense of that, and no real good data or understanding that demand. And it feels to me like it's a bit of a critical gap, particularly as we're now moving to a sort of slightly different phase where some of those resources may be ending quite quickly, and we don't really know how dependent people are on those sources of food, etc., etc. There's a lot of, in my view, unanswered questions when you get down to local authority level, but that's probably not an easy research question.
Super, thank you all for that. Okay, so we've got two questions lined up. One from, I'm going to take them together and then invite whoever from the panel would like to reflect, of course, unless they're sort of directed questions. So the first question is from Flora Douglas and then Sarah Bailey. So Flora, we will get your mic up and running, and then if you want to come on your mic and your camera, if you're happy doing that, that would be super to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Flora. We can hear you.
Okay, you can hear me. Great. Thank you. Thanks for great presentations. Really thought-provoking. My question to the panel is, how can we avoid further entrenchment of in-kind emergency food aid become even more embedded in the public and political consciousness as the means to address the problem of income insufficiency going forward? International evidence suggests that this is a real risk post-public health and economic crisis like COVID-19, and it strikes me as I'm sure many others, and Dan I think's referred to this, that we've just significantly strengthened the secondary feeding system in the UK in our efforts to keep people alive through this crisis.
Thank you, Flora. Sarah, if I can invite you to ask your question, please.
Yes, thanks. It's kind of in a similar vein. It's been great to hear about all the different initiatives that people are doing to address the immediate response that is needed under COVID-19. But I can't help thinking that ultimately we need to see two things. We need to see a significant rise in social security benefits, and we need to see a rise in the minimum wage. And are these things really too radical that we can't all be fighting for these right now? Because it feels as though sometimes these two issues get lost in discussions around data and emergency food provision. And I know there can be a bit of a tension between trying to respond immediately, which is a humanitarian imperative, but also that long-term change. How are we going to achieve it?
Thank you for those great questions, Flora and Sarah. Which of the panelists would like to start us off with any reflections? Any of the panelists particularly? Yes, Emma, that would be super. Thank you.
I mentioned earlier on things that keep me up at night, and I can categorically tell you the thing that has kept me up at night right the way through this is how do you make decisions that aren't about further entrenching the problem? So I think it's a really well-made point. A slicker, more efficient food aid system might have come from a motivation of serving people who are in crisis and from a really good place, but it also makes it far, far easier for the government to ignore the problem when we are really clear. So it's so important, sessions like this together, that when we're speaking also together with government, that we're clear that food bank use is not about food, it's about people not having enough income. And so the answer is not food, the answer is sufficiency of income. And if I've said that once in the last 12 weeks, I've said that 950 times, and we will continue to do that, and that is our responsibility. At the same time as trying to have as dignified a response as possible when somebody is coming to a food bank and is in crisis and they need food, our responsibility collectively is to be kept awake at night with fear of further institutionalization. That is our collective responsibility. So I just want to respond to that question in particular.
Thank you, Emma. Do any of the other panelists want to comment on those two?
I have a couple of things. Just one thing actually really to say. I agree completely with the overarching point that both Emma and Sarah were making on an adequate social security system and wages and basic, whether Human Rights Watch as an organization is going to take a position on universal basic income in one given country is a separate matter. But I think in terms of broad set of options we're talking about, that's the right way to think. The point I wanted to make though was in response to was something that Flora's question triggered for me, which is actually to think more about devolution in the context of how we talk about policy in the UK and how we talk about solutions, and to talk about initiatives and developments at devolved authority level, not just local governments in England. And I think, the more we can look at efforts to get around in-kind provision or voucher provision or whatever it may be, shift towards cash transfers, a shift towards community funds that create new sets of skills and links, and to say back to Westminster, look, these things that you've said are not possible or are too difficult are being done in this country more broadly, this nation state, right? But they're being done by other authorities, and and some of them are taking issues like the right to food or children's rights much more seriously, much more progressively, incorporating them into domestic country level law. Like, this is not an alien concept that is coming out of somewhere way left field. This is these laws are already in operation in this country and are making, or we have to show how they're making change, are making a change.
Thanks, Kartik. Dan?
I mean, lots to say. I mean, I wish I had the answer to how do we avoid further entrenchment. I think, you know, asking that question, learning from, as I said, trying to learn from other countries that have sometimes tried and failed, or others have sometimes done better, is a critical part of it. I do think, again, there's no I'm not going to pretend I have a kind of magic solution to that, but I do think we just need to keep coming back and asking that question, and at risk of repeating myself, that point about building resilience at the community level, I think is where we need to go. The one other just brief point is, I say we talk about moving away from the focus on food availability to talking about food access, and going beyond financial access. And I guess it's just thinking about starting to think about how do people obtain food beyond the market, if you like, which is getting into big separate areas. But anyway, I guess the point is, you know, now is a time for, you know, for radical, maybe idealistic solutions. I think, you know, that there's a risk that at one level people say, oh, we haven't got a magic money tree, we're entering this huge recession, there's not an opportunity to do anything. I think the reverse. I think actually now is the time for us to do some radical stuff that we wouldn't have been able to do before. And again, I don't have the answer for what all those are, but I think there is a big space, and again, we really welcome thoughts from people in this audience and beyond as to what we can do, and some of that sort of the question about, you know, shortening food supply chains. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we can do beyond just thinking about, you know, how do we get people fed. Is how can we get people participating much more actively. There's a whole bunch of things we can do.
Thank you for that. Right, we have another question lined up here. Susie Russell, if you could ask your question, if you could introduce yourself as well, that would be super. And if anyone else has any questions, if you pop your hand up, we can get ready to call on you next. Okay, Susie, thank you. Sorry, we just have to get the IT functions changed. Right, here we are, Susie. Are you able to put your microphone and camera on now? I think according to my panel system, you should be able to. Super, thank you. We can see your microphone now.
Can you see me and hear me?
Yeah,
great.
Brilliant. Thanks, Susie.
Hi. I'm Susie Russell. I'm Development Manager at the Community Supported Agriculture Network UK. And my question, which Dan has kind of just touched on, is whether do the panel think that were we to have a food production and distribution system which had much shorter supply chains and a much greater prevalence of locally produced food, would this have made and in the future make a difference to the sort of amount and depth of food insecurity that we're seeing? Thanks.
Thank you, Susie, for that great question. Dan, would you like to offer some initial reflections back?
Yeah, I'll keep it short. Yes.
That was short. Thanks, Dan. Anyone else in the panel have some thoughts on this?
I mean, maybe, can I speak, Hannah?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Hannah.
I think it's a really good thing for us to properly think about, and I agree with Dan's sort of initial reaction. Certainly, we did a piece of work with a number of others around veg box schemes and the sort of huge increase in demand for them, and also the proportion of them that had special provision in place for vulnerable groups, cross-subsidy elements of their sort of cost structure and so forth, which allowed them to provide boxes for people that didn't have much money. And so I think it's something that would be really good to delve into in a little bit more detail to understand what potential there is there for those kinds of co-benefits of, you know, not only the benefits of short supply chains environmentally and the other aspects that could come from that, but also a kind of social lens and being able to actually support vulnerable communities as well. So yeah, very sympathetic to the question. I don't think we've got enough sort of good evidence to come up with well, it could solve that, it could contribute to this much of the solution. I think that's the bit that we need to kind of get our heads around collectively.
Super, thank you. Emma, yes, please.
Well, just a small point, because it's obviously not my area of expertise, so I couldn't comment on the impact. But it's about, from food bank use, certainly it's definitely about income. So it's about affordability. So I think the solutions have to start there, and potentially there's a whole range of other solutions that go around that. But first and foremost, if 94% of people who are coming to food banks have an average household income per week of £50 after rent, that it's increasing those levels of income that are extremely important driver of reducing food bank use. So just to raise that.
Thank you, Emma. Kartik, sorry, I can't see you on my screen there. So if you'd like to say anything in response to this, please feel free.
Nothing to add. I think next question, or whatever you want to do next.
Super, thank you. Okay, does anyone else have any questions for the panelists? Otherwise, we can sort of wrap up. I think please feel free to put your hands up while I just do some sort of summative, just to give you a sense. There we go. Okay, so we've got one last question from Sunila Lobo. So can IT, sorry, I haven't had a chance to message you yet. Would you mind please doing the microphone? Sorry, I need to change my view on here. Okay, you should be able to do your microphone and camera now, please. And we'd love to hear your question. Thank you.
Okay,
if you could that'd be great.
I'll avoid the camera a bit if you don't mind.
No, of course, that's fine.
I'm on video now. I'm on audio now. So basically, I think I suppose as a food charity, I come from Sedaka and Reading, and I guess I take exception to the fact that a comment that was made about throwing free food to the problem, because Sedaka takes a lot of care in the freshly cooked hot meals that we provide every week to our homeless and people at risk of homelessness every single week. It's done with real care, and with pride I can tell you that it's considered the best in town. And the other effect of the service users understanding the care that was put into it is, of course, it's translated into mental health, very positive mental health outcomes. And we've even heard the comment that it's the humanity of our charity that they really want when you ask them about support needed during COVID. So I just wanted to make that point, because that aspect, the latter part about feeling the support, trusting us to be there, rain, shine, or COVID, that's very important as well. So I guess my question is, I'm a bit surprised about that comment, and I would like to hear a bit more from Dan about that.
Okay, super. Thank you so much for that question. That's great. So I think what we'll do, given the time, is I'll go around all of the presenters, all of the panelists. So if you want to have thoughts in reflection of that question, and then just any last final point, then we can wrap up. Dan, you're invited to comment in the first instance, if that's okay, and then we'll go back around the table, so to speak. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Yeah, good question. And I guess I should, again, some of this is done with limited time to be able to expand properly. But I guess my point is that at a macro level, I don't think throwing free food at the problem is the long-term solution. I recognise that there is a very real need. Lots of people are struggling, and people need to be fed and fed well, and that lots of organisations are doing that in amazing ways, and including lots of amazing volunteers. So I'm not kind of criticising the volunteers or the organisations active in this space necessarily. I think what I'm doing is it's more the point that what I'm upset about is that there is a need for organisations to be stepping in and filling this hole in the first place. So government needs to step up, needs to bring in a right to food and all the other things we know it needs to do, and then we collectively need to build up our community resilience. So that's my point. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Dan. Kartik, just in order of the table, if there were a table, on the imaginary table, if we could hear your thoughts and reflections on that question, and any last comment would be super. Thank you.
Look, I don't think anybody on this panel, or indeed attending the conference, is going to take away from the work that community level groups do in terms of providing mutual aid, places for community to exist and be fostered, for the support to create networks of support for people who don't have those networks of support, or whose networks of support have been taken away from them over the course of 10 to 20 years of defunding of public services, right? I don't think anybody's saying that. I think the concern some people do have is about how large-scale corporate in-kind, the provision of stuff to then be given out in kind is shaping government response in a number of countries, and I think that concern comes significantly for people who have seen the development of food aid in North America and just quite how institutionalized that can be and become. And so, you know, I will cook at my local community kitchen, right, while at the same time saying that that cannot be in and of itself the solution. I rarely bring that sort of personal involvement into what I say on these panels.
Thank you for those reflections, Kartik. Emma, please.
I think that's a great reflection from Kartik at the end, that constant dichotomy of responding to somebody in crisis in front of you while saying it's absolutely shameful that we live in a country where anyone needs to come to a food bank. That and we have to resist with our heels dug into the ground state food-led responses to financial insecurity. We really like, and Kartik mentioned this earlier as well, the fact that where do we sit along the ideological and pragmatic spectrum, where we rejoice that over the summer holidays families on free school meals will be able to continue receiving vouchers, whilst on the other hand thinking it's awful that anyone is having to access a voucher to have sufficient money to be able to feed their families. And we inhabit this dichotomy, but I think it's so important that we keep putting our heels in the ground as far and as deep as we can to resist food in kind responses to what is inherently about economic inequality and injustice in our society. And for as long as we are needed, we will continue to support people in crisis with food parcels, but never happily, and never believing that that should ever be the solution that we collectively work towards.
Thank you, Emma. Anna, would you like to respond to the question and any last thought before we close? Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, I think Emma has said that brilliantly, and I 100% agree. I think perhaps though where the question also I think touches on when food is not being used as a substitute for economic support, food can play a really important role in the sorts of things like community resilience, social support, other things in communities. It can do a range of amazing things in communities, and many people, I'm sure, who are running projects, a part of this conference, are doing some of those amazing things. I think the point comes, as Emma said very, very clearly, that it's when it's a substitute for proper financial protection that we hit up against this kind of big problem at the moment. And you know, the grappling with that tension between, as I think Kartik articulated very well in his opening point, incremental change versus the big change that we need, and where you position yourselves on that spectrum is really difficult. It's a kind of thing that you've got to daily go, are we in the right place? Are we asking for the right things? You know, have we pitched that right? Are we, you know, and I don't think there are any easy answers. I think this conversation has revealed that, but I think I was kind of really struck after hearing none of us kind of shared our ideas of what we were going to say on this panel before the panel. And I was very struck that we actually all came out with very similar position in terms of, you know, the need for financial support, and to that be reflected in, there were different instruments that we talked about for capturing that financial assistance, but we all majored on that. So I think, you know, we're in a good place in terms of, I think, a common perspective on the longer term solution.
Thank you very much. So looking at the time, I very much took advantage of the fact that we don't all have to physically relocate to different rooms to just take the chance to allow people to finish those reflections and hear those last questions. I think what we've heard this morning is a fantastic setup for the 2 days. I think, as Anna just said, you know, we really covered a lot of ground and heard some really interesting and fascinating insights, which I think everyone will be able to bring into the next rest of the conference. Just to flag before we go that there's information in your delegate pack about a Meet the Panelists session this afternoon, which some of the panelists, if possible, will be attending. So please see the pack for details that later. And before we go, if you need to just remember, as Rachel and Katie outlined, that you need to leave this session on the panel on the left rather than just close the browser if possible. That would be super before you move on. So I just want to thank everybody, all of the panelists, for your fantastic insight, for spending time with us this morning. As I say, it's really, really been invaluable, and we can't thank you enough for bringing your expertise and reflections for us all to mull on. And thank you for the questions that you asked from the floor as well. I think they really provoked some really interesting discussion, which will also be really helpful going in. Okay, so I think then I will bring this to a close. I don't think I've missed anything. Katie or any of the other chairs, please flag if I have. But otherwise, I will look forward to seeing everybody throughout the next 2 days. And take care and enjoy your next session, everybody. Okay, we'll bring it to a close. Thank you very much.